What's going on, everybody? And welcome. I'm joking. I would never start a YouTube video like that. Today, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite investments. If you've watched some of my videos, you've heard me talk about it before, and that's going to be VOO, ticker symbol VOO. Now, VOO is going to be the biggest holding that I have in like my Roth IRA. It takes up about 60% of my Roth IRA. I think VOO is one of the easiest and safest things to invest your money in, and I kind of want to talk about why. So I'm going to give you guys a foundation of VOO and some things I like about it, and overall why I think you should invest into it. And just to know going in, VOO is a no hype stock. There's no hype around VOO. It's very, very boring and safe investing. There's no stock picking. There's no guessing what Elon Musk is going to tweet next and, who's going to say what that's going to change a company. VOO is just very simple, safe investing. So I'm going to start with what VOO is if you haven't heard of it or you're unsure of it. So VOO is an ETF, right? And an ETF, all that means, or all that stands for, is an exchange traded fund. It tracks the S&P 500, and if you're not sure of what the S&P 500 is, the S&P 500 is basically the top 500 major companies in the US. So when you invest in VOO, you're buying a tiny piece of Apple, you're buying a tiny piece of Microsoft, Amazon, Tesla, and hundreds of other major companies. And it's all at once. So you get instant diversification by buying 10, 15, 20, 100, $1,000 of VOO. You get instantly diversified, which is super important because that minimizes risk. So what I personally love about VOO is that it's hands-off and it's low cost. So when you start investing into stocks and you start investing into ETFs, right, you'll hear this thing called an expense ratio, and they charge you for buying a certain amount. Well, the expense ratio in VOO is super cheap. It is 0.03%. So for an example, what that means, for every $1,000 that you invest into VOO, you're only going to pay 30 cents for every year that you hold it. This is insanely cheap compared to some other stocks, some other ETFs. Plus, how I mentioned it's hands-off, what I mean by that is, you don't have to keep up with earnings reports. You don't have to keep up with market drama and having to worry and stress about what the news said about your favorite company that you invest in. Because once again, with my channel name, I'm not trying to time the market. I'm not trying to be rich overnight. I'm trying to set realistic expectations for me and my financial freedom. So I'm just building wealth over time, and VOO is what lets me do it. Because, if you think about investing in individual stocks, right? Let's say you invest into Tesla, right? There's so much drama around Tesla right now with Elon Musk, and their quarterly earnings are down. And that creates a lot of volatility. Well, with VOO, you don't have to worry about that because VOO is just going to consistently go up over time because you're extremely diversified into multiple other companies. So while, yes, you're also invested into Tesla, you're also invested into 499 other companies that are going to even that volatility out. So to kind of mention that, I think my favorite thing about VOO, and I feel like a lot of people skip over this when they explain it, is VOO is a self-cleaning ETF. So what I mean by that, let's say you have a company in the S&P 500, right? So let's pick like Amazon, right? And let's say Amazon starts to fail or go out of business. Amazon would get instantly removed from VOO, and then a new stock would get put in place of Amazon. So you're always invested in the strongest companies at any given time. You don't have to manually remove VOO and then have to worry about this or that. The ETF will automatically do it for you and replace it with a new stock. So you're always invested in the strongest companies, and it balances itself out for you. So that's probably one of the best things about it. Now, once again, though, VOO has historically returned about 7 to 10% because it tracks the S&P 500. The S&P 500 has an extremely strong track record because it's the top 500 companies in the US. So what's awesome about investing in something like VOO is you're going to reduce a lot of your risk when it comes to market crashes, when it comes to recessions, when it comes to, things like COVID, right? There was a lot of companies that went out of business or lost 60% of their value or, had terrible earnings reports, and a lot of investors pulled out during something like COVID. Whereas with VOO, sure, it's going to fluctuate up and down, but you'll never have to worry about losing all of your money because it's always going to go up as time passes. Now, obviously we have to assume that past performance doesn't guarantee future results, but because VOO tracks the S&P 500, we can assume, and it's pretty much been proven, that it's one of the most reputable builders of wealth in history. Now, when we look at VOO, versus picking individual stocks, right? Kind of like I told you guys in the beginning, I allocate about 60% of my Roth IRA to VOO. The other 40%, I do personally pick stocks, right? But I pick stocks that are companies I believe in, are companies that I think will do well. And like I said, I make sure that's not the majority of my portfolio. Plus, I'm young and I can afford volatility. I can afford some type of risk, right? A lot of people think they can beat the market by picking individual stocks. And when I say that term, people think they can beat the market, what I'm referring to is that 7 to 10% annually that the S&P 500 goes up. So a lot of hedge fund managers and stuff, they think they can pick stocks and beat that 7 to 10%. And while some of them do it, it's not consistent. There's actually been research and studies shown that people like hedge fund managers that do this for a living do not consistently outperform the S&P 500. So what makes me think I can outperform the S&P 500? I don't think that at all. And that's why I allocate so much of my portfolio strictly into the S&P 500, and I choose VOO as the vehicle for that. So for me, trying to beat VOO is like trying to dunk over LeBron James. It's just not going to happen. So I just prefer to be on LeBron James's team, Now, one thing I will say, and this does deter some people away, but once again, this channel is all about slow stacking your money and building your financial freedom, building that financial foundation. Let's say you take $10,000 and you throw it into Tesla, right? And let's say Tesla blows the earnings out of the water. Everyone starts to love Elon Musk, and Tesla 10x's, and your 10,000 goes to $1 million, and you're rich, right? That's awesome. The trick, though, if you invest that 10,000 into VOO, is that let's say VOO holds Tesla. Let's say Tesla 10x's. VOO's not going to 10x. You're not going to 10x your money. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Because obviously, if you put 10,000 in Tesla and Elon Musk makes a bad tweet and he resigns and no one likes him anymore, and Tesla goes out of business, you lose that $10,000, right? So it's a lot of risk versus reward, and you have to understand your own risk, right? So what I mean by that is, 10,000 into an individual stock and 10,000 into VOO are going to be two completely different things, because VOO is going to be low volatility, low risk, long-term gains, whereas $10,000 into an individual stock is going to be high volatility, high risk, and kind of short-term gains, right? So that's up to your discretion whether you'd want to go into something like VOO or something like an individual stock. But just to know, going into something like VOO, you minimize almost all of your risk. And leading into that, this is why I trust VOO for the long term, right? This is why I trust the S&P 500 for the long term. I'm sure you've all heard of this very heavy word that gets thrown around a lot, especially if you listen to the news, and that word is inflation, right? Everyone's heard of inflation. Everyone knows about inflation. The thing with the S&P 500, and this is a very important concept, as long as inflation continues to rise, which, hint, it will always rise, the S&P 500 will always rise. The S&P 500 and inflation, in my opinion, are hand in hand. The reason why: the US is in a major debt problem. We're in a major debt crisis, right? Our dollar consistently loses its value because we have to keep printing money. By printing money and putting more money in circulation, that rises inflation. This will always happen for pretty much the rest of the time in the US, right? Because inflation rises, prices rise. Companies get more earnings. Those S&P 500 companies get more earnings, get more money, and both inflation and those 500 companies in the stock market rise. So, if you read between the lines, what I'm saying is, I personally believe VOO will always go up because inflation will always go up. So VOO is your vehicle to beat out inflation because the two are hand in hand. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope I kind of described that well enough. So, for my closing thoughts here, I'm not deterring you guys away from other investments. I personally like picking singular stocks. I have a few singular stocks that I invest in that are doing pretty well, and they've already gone over 7%, up. But once again, I want to minimize as much of the risk as possible. So, I still like my individual stocks. I still like my cryptocurrency. I still like other investments, whether that's gold or silver or anything like that. But VOO is going to be the financial foundation. If you're new to investing or you just want something that's going to work for you and it's going to do good for you, you don't need a financial degree. You don't need a financial analyst to know that VOO is always going to go up over time and it's going to be a great place to park your money. So this isn't financial advice, but it's just kind of what works for me. If you guys are investing in VOO, let me know. If you guys have another ETF that you like to invest in, also let me know. I want to thank you guys again for the support on these videos. I've gone from like 30 subscribers to like 300 subscribers in the past like 3 weeks. So that's awesome support, and I really appreciate that. So I hope you guys have a good day. Thank you guys for listening. Let me know your guys' investment strategies in the comments below. And yeah, keep slow stacking.